Welcome to this special report, which is an analysis of what's likely to happen if Trump moves forward with the U.S. attack on Iran. And then Iran seems likely to close down the Strait of Hormuz, through which a tremendous percentage of the energy flows, that is both LNG as well as oil shipments, flows out of the Persian Gulf countries to the rest of the world. So the shutting down of the strait, or even the selective shutting down of it, where Iran would only allow friendly nations' ships to pass but would block other ships, this would be a catastrophic event, a global black swan event, which could devastate the United States economy and could destroy the US dollar. So that's what this report is all about. Let me give you an overview here. It looks like Trump is walking into really a lose-lose situation. Yes, if the U.S. attacks Iran, then the nation of Iran would suffer a tremendous amount of damage, economic damage, infrastructure damage, loss of life, loss of some amount of leadership, etc. But the United States would also lose. Not only would the U.S. probably lose some number of personnel or ships or aircraft or soldiers on the ground or soldiers in military bases around the region, but the U.S. would lose in terms of global credibility. It would lose in terms of its economy, supply chains, and, of course, the impacts of the cutting off of the energy markets, which would lead to a financial catastrophe for the United States. And that's a lot of what I'm about to talk about here. So let me just cover a brief table of contents, so to speak. We're going to cover the financial and monetary ramifications, the market liquidity crisis in particular. I'm also going to cover the geopolitical power realignment that would happen from this. Essentially, the Gulf state countries would strengthen their ties with, Turkey and Egypt, and even with Iran, and they would move further away from the United States and Israel. We're also going to cover the global trade and shipping and supply chain implications. Those are also catastrophic on top of everything else. We're going to cover some raw materials, primary metals and so on, and how supply chains are impacted for that. And then social factors and political factors, as well as labor markets in the United States, how this will cause mass unemployment and will worsen national debt. There will be also implications for agriculture and the food supply, as well as grocery prices, plus risks for accelerating regional warfare. And we'll see power blackouts around the world because of the loss of access to LNG, or liquid natural gas. So that will have implications for the technology sector. Essentially, we are looking at a global reset event. And maybe that's exactly what Trump is trying to pull off. The great global reset, so they can seize your money in the bank. They can tell you they've rescued you with this CBDC that they're rolling out. Look, it's digital money. All you have to do is scan your iris, consent to be surveilled, and you too can have your money back in this digital form. Something like that may be exactly what's planned, but they need a war in order to justify it. So let's start with the basics here. The world runs on oil still. There is some wind and some solar, but it's a small percentage compared to oil and gas. I should say the world runs on fossil fuels. And, of course, right now, I think it's estimated 20 plus million barrels per day of oil come out of the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. And if you haven't yet familiarized yourself with the map of the southern coastline of Iran and the Strait of Hormuz and what that looks like, and the Persian Gulf region and the Sea of Oman, etc., you need to look at that map, because this is going to determine your future. Seriously, no matter where you are listening to this, you need to understand that choke point. It's probably, arguably, the single most critical choke point of geography on planet Earth based on our modern civilization and how it functions. So yeah, over 20 million barrels per day of oil go through there, and approximately estimated 30% of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. So if this is blocked, then we're talking about an almost instant global catastrophic crisis of energy and banking and finance and currencies and electric grids and more. Oh, and don't forget, it's also possible that some of the oil fields in Saudi Arabia could also be struck by Iran, which would further exacerbate the critical fossil fuel shortage. But most experts who have talked about this have said that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz would send oil to $130 to $150 per barrel within just days. So that's, depending on how high that goes, it's almost doubling current prices, which means gas prices would skyrocket, diesel prices, etc. And also then that means transportation costs would go up almost immediately. And then food prices would rise because of the transportation factor. But that's not the end of this. Oil could go to $300 a barrel if the closure continues for a period of time and if there's a significant amount of damage done to Iran's infrastructure by the U.S. bombing. Now, if the U.S. does this, it's kind of economic suicide for the West because Iran can rebuild. But the United States is so heavily leveraged in a financialized economy running on debt fumes that the U.S. could actually be toppled by the repercussions of all of this. That's what we're going to get into here. So, number one, we're going to see massive global inflation because energy inputs are the number one cost for most things, whether it's manufacturing or transportation, as in the case of food. But also for food, there are fossil fuel inputs into farming and harvesting, not just transportation. And even liquid natural gas is used in fertilizer creation, for example. So there are ramifications here that are just catastrophic. So we're talking about inflation going to even officially 15 to 20% for groceries and essential consumer goods, which means in reality that inflation is going to be more like 30 to 40%. Now let's talk about the currency. The US dollar would suffer extreme volatility. There might be an initial surge in dollar value as Europeans and people from other countries rush to the dollar with a perception that it's kind of a safe haven in times of instability. But the dollar's backed by nothing. And one of the things that China could do during all of this is China could simply announce. They wouldn't have to fire a single shot to do this. China could announce that they have gold reserves backing the Chinese yuan currency. In other words, they could announce their audited gold reserves. That would set off a global shockwave of basically panic among those holding dollars or euros or yen. And there would be a mad rush, undoubtedly, into the yuan backed by gold, or even partially backed by gold. So that would be a major blow to Western currencies and a huge boost to BRICS currencies. And remember that China can also pledge loans or grants to Iran for the rebuilding of whatever damage the United States achieves in bombing Iran. Russia can also make such pledges, and perhaps other countries will as well. Although, some countries are so impoverished themselves, like Egypt, that it's unlikely they would have any spare cash, right? But China could, and Iran could relatively quickly rebuild whatever infrastructure was damaged. But the damage to the reputation and the credibility of the US dollar would be permanent. Because if China announces, hey, we're basically dumping the dollar, we're going to dump the rest of our treasuries, and we're going to announce the gold-backed yuan, or renminbi, then the dollar's done. At that point, the dollar is done. And this is one way that China could completely pivot the outcome of this conflict without firing a single shot. Now, on top of this, you would see U.S. Treasury debt yields spike because the Treasury would have to pay higher rates in order to entice anybody to invest in the debt of the United States. This would be even worse if the U.S. suffers, let's say, the destruction or the loss of some naval vessels or stealth fighters, stealth bombers, F-35s, or other aircraft. If Iran manages to destroy almost anything, a plane, a ship, an aircraft carrier, then the United States loses so much credibility on the world stage that Treasury bond yields will rise. And that makes it even more expensive for the U.S. to refinance its exploding debt. So all of that is going to lead to a banking and market liquidity crisis. You will see, almost certainly, a global stock market correction among Western countries. We're talking about, the UK, Japan, the United States, Canada, etc. Probably would see a correction 30 to 50% in the S&P and mainstream stocks. On top of that, yes, tech stocks could also get hit as well. Many people think tech stocks are overvalued right now anyway. Perhaps they are, but this would be a correction event that no one would escape. As that is happening, there would be a massive influx of money moving into gold and silver. So right now, gold is sitting at right around $5,000 an ounce spot. Silver is just under $80 an ounce. Gold would be almost certainly more aggressively impacted by this than silver, at least percentage-wise. It would not be crazy to think that gold would move to $6,000, $7,000 an ounce or $7,500 an ounce in the days following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It could go even potentially much, much higher. Now, will it stay there? Hard to tell. But if China is wanting to announce the gold backing of its own currency, it's actually to China's advantage to have gold prices much, much higher. And you may have noticed, if you've been paying attention to the silver markets and the Shanghai exchanges, that in China, which is currently still in its Chinese New Year phase here, it's just about to end, China has essentially outlawed the manipulation of paper shorts in the silver market. And if they apply the same logic to the gold markets, then that helps eliminate the New York and London attempted manipulation of gold and silver markets through paper selling by JP Morgan and other actors, nefarious actors. What that means effectively is that gold, by simply being allowed to rise organically to its natural price, gold could be headed towards $10,000 an ounce. And that then would mean that the millions of ounces, or gosh, that's not even a big enough number. I don't know how many ounces China has, but let's say it's hundreds of millions of ounces, okay? Or I don't know, maybe it's billions, who knows? Let's just call it a billion for fun's sake here. If they have 1 billion ounces of gold, they would want that gold to be worth more than less, right? So it's actually in China's interest to see gold move towards $10,000 an ounce before they announce that the yuan is backed by gold. Because the higher the gold value, then the higher the percentage of backing of the yuan is represented by the gold once China announces its audited storage numbers. Like, hey, we have 1 billion ounces. I don't even think they describe it in ounces. I think they describe it in tons. And I think it's more like, 20,000 tons of gold is what they have, something in that range. That is a boatload of gold. I can't even imagine 20,000 tons of gold. My goodness. It's going to take a lot of forklifts. So anyway, this is going to spill over into other metals markets, such as copper and aluminum and zinc and so on. And so this is going to cause incredible economic pain for industrial manufacturers and importers of any of these metals, whether in the United States or elsewhere around the world. Now, there's more. There's more. Once war begins, you know what happens to insurance premiums on shipping? Anything that moves through even the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea or the Red Sea or the Suez Canal or the Mediterranean for that matter, you know what happens to the shipping insurance rates? Yeah, they skyrocket. On top of that, probably some of the targets that are going to be bombed by the United States are themselves insured. And also, Iran is going to bomb targets. It's promising to lob all kinds of missiles at Israel. and to turn Tel Aviv into Gaza, essentially, which is some weird kind of cosmic karma on, on Israel. But Lloyd's of London is an insurer that could face almost an incalculable level of claims, perhaps tens of billions of dollars, maybe more. Who knows? I don't know what their portfolios look like, but between the insurance claims and then the heightened new insurance costs for shipping, we're going to see a shutdown of a lot of international shipping in that region for an extended period of time. All right, so this will, of course, add a lot of friction to international banking and finance and supply chains, and it's going to cause economic havoc back in the United States. All right, so now let's talk about geopolitical alignment and what's going to happen, or realignment, technically, what's going to happen after this. Because if the United States attacks Iran, then the U.S. broadcasts to the world that the U.S. empire is the aggressor, that it had no real justification for attacking Iran, that the U.S. is a terror regime that will bomb and kill anyone at once for any reason, even when those countries are attempting to negotiate. This will be the perception all over the world. What will happen is more countries will move away from emphasizing U.S. markets, and they will move away from diplomatic recognition of the United States, one way or another. More countries will come into the fold of BRICS nations. These other countries, whether they are Middle Eastern countries or even South American countries or Southeast Asian or many European countries, Eastern Europe, etc., they will find that dealing with Russia and China and Iran is much safer, more lucrative, and more sane than trying to deal with the United States, which is a nation run by currently satanic pedophiles who are utterly insane. So you're going to see a mass exodus away from the United States in terms of global trade and diplomatic ties. And this is damage, reputational damage to the United States that will last for decades. In particular, you're going to see the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC countries, like Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. They're going to suffer severe economic consequences because of their ties to the United States. And also because, of course, their exports are going to be completely blocked by the Strait of Hormuz. So these regimes, which are, in most cases, tyrannical dictatorships, let's be honest, they are going to suffer internal strife. They're going to suffer economic catastrophe. And they're going to face their own existential crises where many of the current leaders in those countries may not survive. Now, for Israel, Israel will receive a massive bombardment of missiles from Iran. That is, unless somehow the United States has a magical first wave attack weapon, alien technology that fires lasers from orbit or something, and somehow completely disables all of Iran's missiles before they can fire them off. I don't think that technology exists. Thus, within the first few minutes after the missiles from the United States are in the air and U.S. bombers and fighters are in the air, which can now be easily detected by the anti-stealth radar that Iran possesses thanks to China, as well as the Chinese radar ships that are floating in that region and keeping an eye on the skies and are also capable of detecting stealth bombers and stealth fighters, etc. The moment that the U.S. launches an attack, the moment Iran realizes this is happening, Iran initiates, it pulls the trigger on the mass bombardment of Israel. Tel Aviv was nearly destroyed last summer in June during the so-called 12-day war. This time, there will be no stopping. It won't last just 12 days. Iran will fire missiles for weeks on end. And Tel Aviv will be turned into mostly rubble, as well as many military bases and infrastructure systems, including the critical water supply desalination plants that Israel relies on for its water resources. In addition, Israel's ports, ammo depots, military facilities, and oil storage facilities of any kind would probably be targeted for total destruction. Now, the thing is, the United States can't stop this, and the so-called Iron Dome that's said to protect Israel has already been shown to be a complete joke. That's why the United States is sailing the USS Ford aircraft carrier. I believe that's the most recent modern aircraft carrier, sailing that closer to Israel in order to try to provide some air cover for Israel, because the U.S. knows that the Iron Dome doesn't work. On top of that, there's not much left in terms of munitions or interceptors that are fired by the Patriot missile batteries. So even if Israel can stop some of the first incoming wave of missiles or drones, or even hypersonic missiles, which is doubtful, even if they can stop some, Israel very quickly runs out of interceptors and other munitions. Very quickly. Probably within 48 hours. And after that, it's a free-for-all. As long as Iran can shoot off the missiles, then there's nothing Israel can do to stop them. And much of what we see today of Israel will be completely obliterated. And there's very little even that the USS Ford can do to stop that, and U.S. aircraft carriers themselves may suffer damage and have to sail back home for lengthy, expensive repairs. Now, interesting in all of this is the fact that China doesn't want the Strait of Hormuz to be closed, because China, of course, depends on oil exports that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So, China needs to import a lot of energy. However, China has done two things that's really intelligent. Number one, China has been stockpiling a tremendous amount of energy storage, oil in particular. And secondly, China has engaged in more energy partnerships with Russia. Famously, that new pipeline, forgot the exact name of it, but it pipes gas from the Yamal gas fields in northwest Russia, crossing over Mongolia and terminating in northern China in the industrial cities there. That pipeline does not yet exist, but it's under construction, and it shows the partnership between China and Russia. China can lean on Russia and other oil exporters, although Trump has removed Venezuela from that possibility list on purpose. But China has other ways to import energy. In addition, China has the largest solar farms in the world right now. You may not know that. And China is also building wind farms like crazy in order to create a more reliant domestic energy supply that can, help power its energy needs. China also builds coal-fired power plants on seemingly almost a daily basis, and they have numerous nuclear power plants under construction that are faster and much more capable compared to U.S. nuclear power plants that seem to take about 15 years to build. Now, if the Strait of Hormuz closes, Russia will be an economic winner because Russia, of course, exports a lot of energy. The value of that energy would skyrocket. So if the U.S. attacks Iran, one of the main financial beneficiaries will be Russia. Essentially, Russia will earn new billions of dollars or tens of billions. Well, I shouldn't say dollars because they won't be trading in dollars, but rubles or whatever they're trading in. Russia will have a windfall of profits that can help fund its ongoing military operation against Ukraine. So in other words, by Trump bombing Iran is helping Russia fund its war with Ukraine. And you know which countries will be hurt the most by closing the Strait of Hormuz? Western European countries. The United Kingdom. France, Italy, even Germany for that matter, which sooner or later is going to have to turn to Russia for energy, obviously. But, Spain, etc. We're talking about a cutoff of energy that would be catastrophic for many Western European countries. Absolutely catastrophic. Their economies are already very fragile. Look at the economies of Germany and France in particular. they would face a collapse of industry, widespread deindustrialization, followed by widespread job loss, pension losses, bankruptcies, followed by probably nationwide uprising and protests, revolts against their own corrupt governments. You can hardly blame them. So we're talking about the fall of nations stemming from, or at least the potential fall of nations stemming from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So if Trump wants to set all this off, well, I guess all he has to do is start dropping bombs on Iran, and the rest of this happens like dominoes falling. So there's more. We haven't talked about the disruptions in global trade and shipping, supply chain collapse. So first of all, war in that area would cause a great many ships to be unable to traverse the Suez Canal because they don't want to get anywhere near this war. They don't even want to sail through the Red Sea. And the insurance companies may prohibit them from doing that anyway. So they're going to have to sail all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way to south of Africa. So that adds about 2 weeks of transit time and millions of dollars of cost per voyage of these large cargo ships. So now we're talking about increase in transportation costs and delays in supply chains. The fact that these ships would no longer be going through the Suez Canal would cause a collapse of revenue for Egypt, which is already broke, like I mentioned earlier. Egypt is paid billions of dollars a year by the United States, basically to not attack Israel. With the money collapsing because the U.S. started this war, Egypt might decide, hey, we're done with the West, and we're going to attack Israel. There could be an Egyptian-Israeli war in southern Israel that begins because of this. No joke. I mean, they've been itching for that for a long time. In addition, there would be basically global gridlock in shipping. So we're talking about many ships not being able to pick up loads, oil or gas. So they're basically just stranded out there, just sitting out there, costing tens of thousands of dollars per day. We're talking about then freight rates skyrocketing, even for those that are able to traverse some of these different choke points, such as the Red Sea or the Suez Canal. The war risk, as I already said, would vastly increase insurance costs. So the bottom line is we're talking about supply chains getting delayed and supplies getting way more expensive. So who does that hurt the most? Think about it around the world. Who does that hurt the most? So who is the most dependent on importing materials for manufacturing? Well, in Asia, clearly that's Japan and South Korea, and to some extent Taiwan. In Europe, that's clearly Germany and France. They would be hurt the most. We're talking about automotive industries, electronics. We're also talking about shortages of those things. So if you thought it was hard to get RAM or CPUs or GPUs or hard drives, now just wait until this war begins and then try to buy hard drives or, NVIDIA GPUs or what have you. It's going to get insane. We're going to have a global bottleneck of everything. India would suffer through a lot of inflation and cash flow problems, probably social unrest in India if fuel prices rose significantly, because many people in India, a country of a population of over 1.3 billion people, many people are just on the edge of poverty. In fact, most of them. And even small increases in fuel prices have a devastating impact on the ability of Indian people to afford to eat. So if fuel prices start to skyrocket, you're either going to have government subsidies, which puts the Indian government into deep debt, or you're going to have social revolts in India. Now, in China, this is going to hurt China too. That's why China doesn't want this war. China relies on a lot of imports for its industry, including energy imports, like I mentioned earlier. So in China, they would have to probably impose fuel rationing. and they would tend to reserve fuel for the military and critical infrastructure to keep cities running. China would suffer a manufacturing decline, which means a decline in exports, and so that would cause more domestic unemployment that would tend towards a social uprising in China as well, as unemployed, hungry, broke people are typically not happy with their governments. So the destabilization here will impact both Eastern countries and the West. Well, let me just say, Eastern countries like China, but also India, as well as Europe, as well as Japan, Korea, and the United States. It's like nobody gets away scot-free from this, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody. So in the United States, you could expect gasoline to hit, well, it depends on the state, but in California, it'll easily be over $10 a gallon. Even in places like the Midwest right now, it could easily hit $6 a gallon. Transportation costs will rise significantly, which means consumer goods costs will go up, farming costs will go up, all the inputs into food will rise, and so food prices will get even higher. Meanwhile, Trump and the White House will tell us every day that all the prices are going down, everything's more affordable, because they think you're stupid and they think you don't shop for food. But when you do shop for food, you will, of course, notice, oh my God, this is insanely expensive, even more than we already witnessed. Globally, the bottom line here is we're going to look at a global depression, stagflation, high inflation combined with negative growth, a contraction of economies. So the shutting down of industry, another way to say this, the contraction of industrial output combined with much higher prices on consumer goods and food. This is what's going to happen globally, just so that Trump can appease Netanyahu and do the bidding of the crazed Zionists in Israel. I mean, imagine, they're willing to sacrifice the whole world just to hurt Iran, Amazing. Corporate profits would plunge, which means stock market valuations would also plunge. We'd probably have a big correction in the U.S. stock markets. Bankruptcies would cascade throughout the system, and that would especially hit hard the commercial lending banks that are already reeling from making commercial real estate loans with a very high rates of non-occupancy. I guess I could say low occupancy rates of commercial buildings all across America right now, especially in the major cities. That's going to get even worse, and you're going to have bank failures in the commercial sector stemming very quickly from this war if it happens. The aviation industry would be sharply impacted due to loss of transportation demand, higher prices of jet fuel, as well as less discretionary income by air travelers. You're going to see energy-intensive primary materials such as aluminum or concrete or polymers or steel, anything that requires a lot of energy will get crazy expensive. And so that's going to result in a decline in production or construction as well. So far fewer commercial buildings will be built, fewer homes will be built, fewer factories will be built, but also, since this will affect aluminum and steel, fewer automobiles, fewer aircraft. This will be across the board. Any material that has a lot of energy that goes into it is going to get crazy expensive. So this leads to the next set of dominoes to fall in all of this, which is the social factors. Now, I've already mentioned quite a few social factors here, which is widespread unemployment and desperation among people in various countries, including India, probably Germany, perhaps China, perhaps South Korea, etc. These people will tend to rise up. Their household budgets or discretionary income will be destroyed by the price shock of supply chain price increases, food increases, and energy price increases, transportation increases. So at first, people are going to be really, really freaked out, panicked, even just fearful. It won't take long before that transforms into anger, anger at their own governments, especially in the United States, because everybody's going to point to Trump and say, "You son of a bitch, this was your choice. You initiated this war. You didn't have to. Why did you do this? We're going broke over here. Our business is failing. Our farm is failing. We're having to sell our house. We can't afford transportation. The food inflation is through the roof. Can't afford to feed our kids. You, Trump, you did this." You're going to hear a lot of that. A lot of that. And of course, politically speaking, the GOP will be absolutely destroyed in the midterms. Just obliterated. Probably the Senate as well, which means that Democrats will control the House and the Senate. And at that point, they're only going to have one agenda for the next 2 years, starting January of 2027. What will their agenda be? Criminally prosecute Trump and his family and his cabinet members. Like anybody within arm's length of Trump will be investigated and prosecuted by any means possible for years to come. Now, I understand that the DOJ would still be under the control of Trump, and Pam Bondi, who is covering up the crimes of pedophiles, obviously there's no criminal that she won't cover up. There's no crime too great for Pam Bondi to sweep under the rug. But when the Democrats sweep into power after the 2028 election, that is, if we still have a country by then, I'm not entirely convinced we will, but who knows. At that point, then the Democrats put in their own attorney general. It's their DOJ, it's their House, it's their Senate, it's their presidency, and it's their DOJ, it's their FBI, etc. At that point, Trump and his family will have to flee the country. They'll probably end up living in Israel if there's anything left, or somewhere else, far out of the way, because they will all be criminally prosecuted. But those are just some of the political ramifications of this. And most of the American people will support that because people will be living in poverty and bankruptcy and homelessness and collapse, because that's what's going to happen here. If Trump moves forward with this, he's going to cause widespread poverty. And it's the easiest way to lose an election is to make people impoverished across the country. Remember, it's the economy, stupid. Remember that from the Bill Clinton days? And need I add, as people lose everything, as Gerald Celente says, when they lose everything and they have nothing left to lose, they lose it. Yeah, you're going to have social unrest. You're going to have uprisings. You're going to have, basically in America, you're going to have, in certain areas in the cities, you're going to have something that looks a lot like a civil war. But it won't be one unified civil war. It'll be city by city. Trump will probably end up deploying the U.S. military against the American people and using U.S. military assets such as A-10 Warthogs, firing upon crowds of Americans because Trump has already demonstrated that he's willing to order ICE agents to execute Americans in broad daylight, in cold blood on the streets of Minneapolis. So they've already said they're willing to kill Americans who are protesting. If you're out there in the protest crowd exercising your First Amendment rights, Trump can just say, we'll drop bombs on those crowds. They're all terrorists. And then, Pam Bondi will give an announcement. Well, we saw they were terrorists, so we had to kill him. Because that's what they do every time. If they kill you, then they say you're a terrorist. So, yes, we're going to have uprisings, civil war type of scenarios. We're going to have probably labor strikes. We're going to have left-wing sabotage teams, no doubt, doing crazy things, setting vehicles on fire on the bridges, spiking railroads, whatever other kind of chaos they can cause. It's going to be bad. It's going to be bad because you're going to have a civil uprising. You might actually have a left-wing attempt to overthrow the United States government. I don't think that attempt would succeed, but they might try it. Heck, if it gets bad enough, there might be a military coup against Trump, for all we know, because the military still leans, at least the higher brass still leans left. There might be a point, if their ships are sinking and their planes are getting shot out of the sky, there might be a point where they say, no more. We're going to arrest Trump because he's unfit to be our commander-in-chief. I mean, that's a possibility. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying these are the kinds of things that you should be considering. The worse the U.S. military does in this war with Iran, the higher the chances are that there could be a military coup against the Trump regime. And believe me, almost nobody is going to defend the Trump regime. Not even former Trump supporters, except for, a few connected neocons and whatever, the hardcore, paid MAGA propagandists. Yeah, of course, they're going to support Trump. But most of former MAGA supporters despise Trump at this point. I would say 90% of them. So there's not going to be, it's not going to be like a pro-Trump Second Amendment uprising against the left or against a military coup. Basically, I think most of the former Trump supporters would sit back and say, yeah, do what you got to do to the military. If the military were carrying out a coup against Trump, I actually think, and I'm not condoning this, just to be clear, I'm not condoning it. I don't want any violence. I'm not calling for it. I'm just saying that I think a lot of Americans would silently cheer that at this point. It's so insane what's happening in D.C. that even a return to the days of Joe Biden, believe it or not, would seem more sane than what we have now. And I know that sounds astonishing, especially to hear that coming out of my mouth, as much as I was a critic of Joe Biden. But where we are now is literally worse in so many ways. And I'm no fan of Joe Biden. Don't get me wrong. But we need to restore some sanity here in this country. We've got to stop these punitive tariffs. These are my opinion statements, okay? So I'm going to take a tangent here off the analysis for a second. But in my opinion, we got to stop the mad money printing and funding the Pentagon death machine. A $1.5 trillion budget is insane. We have to stop these insane tariffs, which are destroying our supply chains, destroying U.S. manufacturing businesses, and raising prices on consumers. We got to stop the government's war against the people. You can't have masked government thugs running around the streets shooting Americans, for God's sake. We got to stop Trump cozying up with every poisonous corporate monster that exists out there, from, Bayer, which bought Monsanto and pushing glyphosate, to Pfizer pushing the vaccines, to big tech pushing surveillance and Skynet and autonomous killer robot technology or drone technology that's probably going to be turned against the American people. This is insane. So that's just my opinion. I think that a lot of Americans would either do nothing or would actually cheer some kind of change in leadership right now. There's no question in my mind that that's the way a lot of people feel. And if Trump orders this attack on Iran, it's going to get even worse for him, I think, especially if the U.S. loses assets out there. Okay, so those were my opinions. Let me get back to to my attempt to continue this analysis. All right, let's talk about labor markets and unemployment. Obviously, mass unemployment will explode. You're going to have a welfare state crisis because so many people will need some kind of government assistance. The number of people on food stamps will explode. The number of people showing up at food banks will explode. Energy subsidies, there's going to be record demand for that. Eventually, you're going to have a government that just starts handing out money. Universal basic income, UBI. And on top of this, don't forget there's AI job replacement that's happening at the same time. So you're going to see a wave of unemployment even without this war. The war will only make it worse. And most people are going to lean on the government. And that means in order to provide a UBI, Trump or whoever is in power is going to have to print trillions of dollars, like $1 trillion a month. to cover all these benefits. And then U.S. debt goes into a parabolic blow-off phase that ends in absolute catastrophe and total dollar devaluation. And now then, on top of this, there's no reason to believe that the war would stay limited to just the U.S. and Iran. It would grow. Remember what Michael Yon always says, that wars grow. They always grow. They become larger than you expect. They take longer than you expect. And they go in directions that you don't expect. So wars are unpredictable. They always grow and they always take longer. That's exactly what's going to happen. This could end up involving, of course, the Persian Gulf nations there, from Qatar and the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, etc. But it could also involve Turkey, Egypt, and then Russia and China. It could involve, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. They're in the region. There are a lot of scenarios here that escalate this thing way beyond our control. This thing could go nuclear. Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran has the technical capability to put nuclear weapons on missiles, I believe. And at the same time, Russia could give Iran nuclear weapons. Or Pakistan could. Or China could, for that matter. Here, have 10 nukes. Have fun with the U.S. Navy. Iran has the ability to launch nuclear weapons and to get them within close enough proximity to detonate on top of aircraft carriers. Do you think do you think a 100 kiloton nuclear warhead will sink an aircraft carrier? Well, that's about, what would that be? It's like 7 times larger than Hiroshima, something like that. Yes, that will destroy an aircraft carrier and it will kill everybody on board. Don't be surprised if you wake up one morning soon and you find out that Iran has sunk a United States aircraft carrier and 5,000 sailors are dead or close to it. And, the Eisenhower or the Abraham Lincoln is at the bottom of the sea. Don't be surprised, because that's exactly what can happen. If that were to occur, of course, Trump's political future is done. And the anti-war protests nationwide would be just immeasurable. But also, the reputation of the United States would collapse worldwide. That's when you would see China move on Taiwan. That's when you would see China announce probably the gold-backed valuation of its own currency, the mass selling off of U.S. treasuries, and even Japan would probably just start dumping treasuries at that point. It would have no choice. The dollar would be finished. The U.S. economy would collapse. The presidency would be in chaos. You would end up not just with impeachments, but criminal trials against Trump and his family members, as the United States economy would be collapsing with the collapse of industry, the collapse of exports, the collapse of manufacturing, and the collapse of supply chains from other countries. Because again, the disruptions of international shipping and the disruptions on energy would be catastrophic and widespread. So from this, many areas around the world would experience rolling blackouts because their power grid relies on LNG, or in some cases like diesel backup generators, etc. But a lot of gas turbines power the power grid in different areas. When power grids fail today, it's a big deal because it takes down data centers. And I'm not even talking about AI data centers. I'm talking about just cloud-based computing. And in China, there's a lot of that. And you start disrupting China's power grid, then things get pretty dicey there with the economy and with e-commerce. And also, of course, industry and manufacturing. Semiconductor manufacturing would be impacted as well. If you lose power in a semiconductor factory, you lose the whole factory full of like 3 months of semiconductors that are in process. They're done. They're ruined. You can't lose power, or you lose the entire harvest. is the way that works. So unreliable power will have massive economic consequences in terms of disrupting microchip production. If you thought GPUs and RAM were scarce today, just wait until Trump starts bombing Iran and the Strait of Hormuz gets closed. In fact, one of the most sane things you could do if that happens is run out and just buy up all the computer stuff you need the very next day, because it's going to be gone. It's going to be gone for years. That is where this is going. So, bottom line, Trump is about to trigger a global reset event. He's about to become the Black Swan. Like Trump is the Black Swan. Like he painted himself black and used duct tape to put on some wings, and he's trying to fly off a tall building, you know. Trump is the Black Swan if he attacks Iran. He is going to set into motion a cascading series of highly destructive events that will cause social upheavals, massive currency devaluations, government destabilization worldwide, geopolitical conflict, political ramifications in the United States that will be devastating for the GOP, as well as mass poverty and homelessness and famine on a global basis as food prices skyrocket because of the increased costs of energy inputs into food as well as transportation. That's what Trump is about to set off. Trump will become the most hated person in history, right next to Adolf Hitler and maybe Joseph Stalin. But actually, Trump would probably be right there next to Hitler, I'm guessing, in the amount of damage that he is about to unleash on the world for no reason other than to appease the insane apocalyptic Zionists of Israel. There is no reason to attack Iran. There is no justification. Iran is no threat to the United States. This is something that Trump would be doing by choice, and the world would recognize that, the world would remember that, and as every person suffers for a decade to come, who would they blame for that? Donald J. Trump. And the Trump name will become one of the most hated names in history. So much so that Trump family members will eventually probably be forced to change their names. Anything with Trump on it will be considered evil, filled with hate. If you thought Trump derangement syndrome was bad before, it's about to go on turbo power if Trump starts this war. The Trump name will be hated for generations to come. Kind of like the name Richard Nixon is hated, and Richard Nixon didn't hardly even do anything bad compared to what Trump is doing. It's not even close. I mean, it really is no comparison at all. And anybody in close proximity to Trump will find themselves completely blacklisted, unemployable, reputation destroyed. Anybody who served in the Trump administration is going to realize this reputation risk will be permanent, a permanent stain on their record. People like Pete Hegseth will never find meaningful employment again. Even RFK Jr. must be looking around right now and wondering, like, what did I get dragged into at this point? J.D. Vance will have no political future, etc. So these are some of the ramifications if Trump attacks Iran and if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. So let us all step back from this and pray and hope. I mean, use every means possible, meditate, whatever, that this war does not get initiated by Trump or by anybody. We need to step away from this escalation, de-escalate, bring the world back from the brink of economic destruction so that we can find some stability, we can find some, reliability in supply chains, in manufacturing, in food prices, in currencies, etc. War helps no one other than, Netanyahu and the military-industrial complex. Unfortunately, that's who's pushing Trump's buttons right now. If Trump listens to Netanyahu, it would be the most catastrophic mistake, not only in his life, but the most catastrophic military mistake in the history of the United States of America, for its entire history, including the Civil War. That's how bad this is. So let's hope it doesn't happen. Trump has a chance to turn some of this around. He could fire Susie Wiles and dump all these horrible advisors and actually start listening to the people. There's still a chance to do that. He could pivot now and maybe save the GOP in the midterms if he wants to. But it doesn't look like that's what's happening. So we'll see. We'll see.